Hi, my name is Jenna Tershi, and I'll be presenting on biblical empathy. So we'll start out with the New Testament and empathy up there in the upper right, or upper left, sorry, and then we'll go to biblical empathy, and then we'll go and focus on Luke 23, and then we'll go down to the bottom right-hand corner to focus on faith and empathy, and then we'll jump up to the top there for neuroscience and empathy. So let's start out with New Testament. There we go. So in the New Testament, Jesus is obviously a great example for how to be empathetic. So I wanted to really focus on a passage from Matthew. It's Matthew 5, verses 43 and 44. And you can read it there, but it says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you," which was completely revolutionary for the time. That was not the way that most people thought. And so it's also a great method for being empathetic, which can be really hard. So prayer helps, obviously. Sometimes praying for people can really be the best way to cognitively empathize with them, even if it's difficult to automatically empathize with them. So moving on to biblical empathy. So a couple examples here. Luke 19, verses 1 through 10, which is the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. And then John 11, which is the story where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. So we'll start with Jesus and Zacchaeus in Luke. So Zacchaeus was a wealthy tax collector. He was also fairly short, and so he was not able to see through the crowds when Jesus came to town. So he was resourceful though, and he climbed a tree and was able to see Jesus, and Jesus saw him and came to Zacchaeus' house, which for Zacchaeus being a wealthy tax collector, that was not something that was expected at the time. So Zacchaeus really teaches us that we shouldn't make assumptions about others, because if Jesus would empathize with Zacchaeus and really know his heart, it means that Jesus will also know our hearts. So we'll go now to John 11. So this is where you get that famous verse, "Jesus wept." It's also the shortest verse in the Bible. So in this passage, Jesus is visiting Judea, and he's visiting his friends Mary and Martha, whose brother Lazarus has recently passed away. And Mary and Martha are saying, well, if you were here only a couple days ago, this wouldn't have happened. And Jesus he knows what's going to happen. He knows the outcome. He knows that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. But still, he's able to empathize with his friends and with the other Jews there who were grieving. So, and then you get that famous verse, "Jesus wept." So a pretty remarkable story there, and also great foreshadowing for the events of Easter. So speaking of Easter, if you back it up a little bit, is the crucifixion, which Luke 23 has a really good description of that. And so even during his crucifixion, Jesus was empathetic, which is just amazing. So for example, specifically in Luke 23, verse 34, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." So even while he was on the cross, Jesus could empathize with the people who had called for his crucifixion. And then a little further down, if you go to Luke 23, verses 40 through 43, Jesus is talking to, so there's two thieves that were crucified with Jesus, and one of them is very non-repentant. He is jeering at Jesus and saying, "If you are who you say you are, why don't you come down?" And the other thief knew that he was being punished rightly, and he asked Jesus to remember him when Jesus came into his kingdom. And so Jesus recognized the second thief's sincerity, and he empathized with him, and because he was right there with him, and he promised that thief, the second one, would be in heaven with him that day. And then moving on to faith and empathy, so my personal faith and my personal experiences with empathy. So I've noticed that as a Christian, I'm called to be like Christ, because literally the word Christian translates to little Christ. So quite literally, we're called to be like Christ. And as you can see from the previous examples, Christ is a really, really good example to follow in regards to empathy and a lot of other things, but also empathy. So following that theme, I try to see people as God sees them as much as I can, as bearing the image and likeness of God. And I found that it's much more difficult to dislike someone or to maybe not disagree with them, but it's much more difficult to have a grudge against someone if you take a moment to picture how God thinks about them. So in a practical sense, just through my involvement with the church, through my life, I've come to know a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, and this helps to broaden my knowledge of the world so that I have a broader perspective and I can better empathize with, again, a broader group of people. And I've noticed, so I'm an advisor at CCU, and I work with a lot of students, and sometimes I have to deliver news that they don't want to hear and that I don't necessarily want to deliver. And so I've noticed that praying before some of those difficult phone calls can make a lot of things much better. So it leads to better outcomes, both for me, makes the call easier, and the student, because am able to see things from their point of view a bit better and just better empathize with them. So putting it all together, neuroscience and empathy. So in our textbook, the Desetti and Ix textbook, I was pretty fascinated by the mirror neurons because they come up a lot and they're present for most of the processes related to empathy, whether that's automatic or cognitive. So they're necessary for us to put together the visual clues and vocal clues about others' emotional states so that we can get into that empathetic space and really be there with the other person. And they automatically mirror our reactions to what we're seeing, which I thought was really cool. So to tie it back to a previous example, when Jesus was seeing his friends grieving, he mirrored them. And that's when you get that famous verse, Jesus wept. And then we have references. Thank you very much.